I would argue that the family farm is indeed an endangered species in America today. We lose about 1.5 million acres of working farmland every year to development. Farmers can no longer afford to keep their land, and of course, they sell for development. We also in this country have an aging population of farmland owners. The average age of a farmer today in America is 60 years old. And they are these small family farms, Greg. They are land rich and cash poor by and large.
All right, folks, it's time for our favorite podcast, Cut to the Chase. I know there are a lot of environmentalists out there that are a little worried about what's going on in the world and where are we going in the future, how are we going to deal with these issues. These issues do exist. I brought Larry Selzer on, CEO and president of the Conservation Fund, to discuss what the Conservation Fund does and how I think they might actually help the future of the environmental movement. So, Larry, how are you doing today?
I'm wonderful, Greg, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on.
So going through your website, there's so much to talk about. I try to keep my podcast about 30 minutes. So we'll try to get through the entirety of it all and cut to the chase. Tell me about your organization, how long they've been around, what they do.
The Conservation Fund is a national nonprofit organization. We're 40 years old this year, and our primary business is buying land for permanent conservation. We do that all across the 50 states. We don't work internationally, but over the last 4 decades, we've protected more than 10 million acres, almost $12 billion of investment in American landscapes, natural, cultural, and historic. In addition, the Conservation Fund is the only nonprofit in the country that is chartered for both land conservation and economic development. And so working at the interface of business and the environment, trying to balance economic return and environmental protection is where we like to play.
Nice. So I think that the movement, I don't want to group the entire movement as one, but I think there's parts of the movement that now are coming to grips with messaging and taking the issues and incorporating the economics behind it. Because that seems to be something that not everybody, but a lot of the world is, prioritizing. Unfortunately for me, I do, I prioritize economics or whatever, but I do believe the planet, the economy is the environment kind of thing and all that stuff. So, all right, let's break this down. I know I've gone through a lot of what you guys do and what you show on your website. So I know we're talking about like rural areas. We're talking about small, mid-sized farms. We're talking about forests. We're talking about these economic opportunities. So let's start first with the farms, the small and mid-sized farms. Explain to me like exactly what you do and what's out there right now and how you play into the equation. I mean, let's say you're a small, mid-sized farmer, you're listening to this, you're at risk, there's a lot of pressure, you might have to sell and you're going to be selling it to developers, changing the whole community. So talk to me about that.
Sure. Let's set the stage just a little bit. First of all, we believe that conservation includes people and communities. It's not setting land aside from people, it's setting land aside for people. And that includes working landscapes, ranches and forests and farms. And if you think about endangered species, Greg, I would argue that the family farm is indeed an endangered species in America today. We lose about 1.5 million acres of working farmland every year to development. These are primarily the smaller farms that surround major metropolitan areas that are growing fast, like Atlanta or Charlotte, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Little Rock, Arkansas, Bellevue, Washington. These are places where the development is sprawling out into the productive agricultural land. The tax basis goes up. Farmers can no longer afford to keep their land. And of course, they sell for development. We also in this country have an aging population of farmland owners. The average age of a farmer today in America is 60 years old. And they are these small family farms, Greg. They are land rich and cash poor by and large. In other words, the land represents their single biggest equity, and their retirement in waiting is the value in that land. And what we decided to do was create a mechanism, a perpetual motion machine, if you will, a revolving pool of capital that would allow us to go in and work with the aging farmer to acquire their farm, thereby satisfying their need for cash for retirement. We pay them the full fair market value of that land, which is at an elevated rate because of the development pressures. We then lease that farm to a young farmer who wants to get into farming but can't afford to buy a farm because the price is elevated due to the development value. We then work with a state agency, local jurisdictions, and philanthropy to put a conservation easement on that farm, which strips away the development rights and returns that land to agricultural value. And at that point, the young farmer can get financing to buy that farm from us. When we sell the conservation easement, we return about 50% of our investment back to our revolving fund. And when we sell the land to the young farmer, we return the other half of the value to the revolving fund. And once that money is back in our bank account, we can use it to buy the next farm. We started this in Georgia around the city of Atlanta, which is the fastest growing urban center in the world, where there still is about 30,000 acres of productive agricultural land, but it's being lost at an accelerated rate. We've had great success. We've now expanded to Charlotte, North Carolina, outside of Chicago, Illinois, and in Little Rock, Arkansas. We envision this as a national platform, but we're growing very methodically so that we can make sure we do a great job with the landowners and the communities that are in those areas.
So, for those that are listening, you got to check out the website. They've got an interactive map which shows state by state all the successes that the Conservation Fund has achieved over the years. I'm from Miami, and so when you're talking about this, I know there's, for years been a lot of pressure. We have an agricultural industry that's in South Florida, and there's so much development. There's always pressure to, buy out the agriculture. I don't know if you've had a chance to wrap your brain around what's going on over there. I'm hoping.
Yes, we're very active across the state of Florida. In fact, not far from Miami, but in the Jupiter, Palm Beach area, not only are we buying undeveloped land to add to the National Wildlife Refuge, but we're creating a corridor along the Loxahatchee River, which will protect those lands. These are privately owned lands with conservation easements, meaning non-development easements placed on them. And it's an incredible vision for that part of the state where development has overwhelmed almost every other natural resource along the coast. And so all across the state of Florida, which is experiencing tremendous growth, but in many other parts of the country, the answer isn't for the government to own land, although in many cases that is the right answer. But in other areas, the answer is to allow those lands to stay in private hands on the tax roll, supporting economic activity, but restrict the development to things that are compatible with the future sustainability of those landscapes. And in Florida, that's what we're focused on.
All right, going back to the small and mid-sized farms. Last night I was actually at an event and I was talking to, I'm out here in Western Massachusetts right now, and one of the people at the event, his family has owned over 200 acres of farmland, and he was complaining that he doesn't have the younger generation to turn to. And, he was telling me about all the strains and stresses that he has trying to maintain it, and, his heartfelt connection to the land and all that. So, my two questions are, what's the largest size that you will deal with is number one. And I know you're talking about selling to the young farmer, but to me, I think there might be also opportunities within, wealthy older people who's the next generation, they don't know what they want to do with themselves. I mean, somebody that's out here right now, 75 years old, wealthy, worried about, the grandchildren or whatever, is this something that they could look into? Because I would think that they might be a good partner with you.
Certainly, it'd be a great opportunity to engage with people who either have land or resources that they would like to put to work to conserve some of these magnificent landscapes. You asked about the size, and I would say we're only limited by the amount of capital that we had to spend. And so, to the extent that there are people out there who have means, who want to invest and help us increase the size of our capacity to acquire farms, that would be a wonderful way to engage. Just as an example, I'm going to give you a sense of scale, because scale and speed and efficiency are important when you're doing these transactions. You have to meet the needs of the current landowner. You have to manage yourselves in a business-like and professional way, and you have to deploy capital the same way that any good business would think about capital allocation. We have a similar program focused on large, intact working forests. And by working forests, I mean lands that are still being harvested, although in a sustainable way. Just as we're losing 1.5 million acres of working farms every year in this country, we lose 1 million acres of working forests in this country to fragmentation and development. And in that instance, where we've been able to mobilize a significant amount of capital, over $1 billion over the last 10 years, we have acquired over 1 million acres of working forests. Interestingly, as a nonprofit, Greg, we're one of the largest timberland owners in the United States. All of those lands are on the tax rolls. All of those lands are being harvested to support the jobs and the communities in those rural areas. The mills are staying open. The products that we need as Americans are being delivered. And yet, all of those acres ultimately will be permanently conserved through a conservation easement that allows sustainable harvesting, but prevents subdivision and development. And so, just as we're tackling this great challenge of working farms, we are also tackling this challenge of working forests. And these lands provide us with healthy food, local food. They provide us with clean air and clean water, almost 2 million jobs in the forests. And these are jobs that can't be exported overseas. So this is an instance of balancing economic and environmental objectives, using conservation as a solution to some of the proximate and present challenges that we have in this country.
All right. So on your website, you had a quote about how many acres of forest are at risk for the next couple of decades. How did you come? What was that figure? I can't remember it off the top of my head. And how did you come up with that amount?
Let me just give you a little history. It wasn't that long ago, maybe 25, 30 years ago, that most of the working forests in this country were owned by big industrial companies. They made pulp and paper and solid wood products. Companies like International Paper and Georgia Pacific and Union Camp. And over the last couple of decades, not only has the industry consolidated, but they sold all of their working forests. In all, 90 million acres of private land changed hands. It was the largest transfer of private lands in the history of the United States. And when that tidal wave of disinvestment happened, 20 million acres of forest were lost right off the top for development, and they were converted to houses or shopping centers, office parks. 70 million acres were acquired by a new class of owner. And these were people who figured out that they could aggregate pension fund money and university endowments and buy forests as a new asset class, because forests, if sustainably managed, yield about 5, 6, 7%. But because they were using pension fund money and they structured these investments as 10-year horizons, they had to maximize return for the pensioners. And that meant not sustainably harvesting timber, but liquidating the timber and selling the property off for real estate development. And over the last 15 years, we've lost another 20 million acres of forest. So we went from 90 to 70 to where we are today at 50 million acres.
Wow.
Now, of those 50 million acres, the U.S. Forest Service estimates that roughly 10% of that, or 5 million acres, is of high conservation value. And that's our target. We're trying to conserve those 5 million acres of working forest that have high conservation value. Now we're well on our way. We've surpassed 1 million acres already, 20% of the way to our target. We're limited only by the amount of capital we can deploy. And this is another example of if people want to put their money to work, not only to do good work for the environment, but to do good work for rural communities and economic development, manufacturing in the United States, all the things that this country is focused on today. This is a prime opportunity.
All right. So I know this is a pretty basic question, but I mean, what constitutes a forest?
Yeah, it's actually an excellent question. Forests obviously are comprised of trees. Now, there are natural stands of trees and there are planted stands of trees. The planted stands of trees are more like an agricultural crop. You might harvest every 25 or 45 years and then replant. But all of those forests sequester carbon and help address climate change. All of those forests represent habitat for wildlife. They represent opportunities for outdoor recreation. They provide clean water and clean air, and they provide jobs and jobs in rural communities where they're needed the most. And so while each type of forest has advantages, all intact, large working forests are extremely valuable for this country.
So I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years reading about trees and how they're interconnected, and I'm real big with the climate change. And so I was like, oh, we need more trees. And then I was reading that some of the trees are being placed, in the wrong spots, and there's too much homogeneous populations. And then in certain places, they're not even, some of the trees are so stressed, they're not actually capturing the carbon, they're releasing the carbon. And, I guess this segues into my question of you're talking sustainable. What do you mean by sustainable? And at what level have we do we still need to do research in terms of best practices for all these objectives?
Yes, and it's a great question, Greg. And for this, I want to answer you in a bifurcated way, if you will. There are private lands and there are public lands. Public lands, meaning the U.S. Forest Service, federally owned lands. There are also state forests and state owned lands. The private side is largely governed by a universally accepted certification system called SFI, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. Over 375 million acres are certified to this sustainability standard. And that ensures a number of things. First of all, that you're not harvesting more than you're regrowing. That's called a balanced growth and yield. That you're not harvesting out of sensitive areas like steep slopes or stream buffers or lakefront. That you're not harvesting where there are endangered species. It's a whole series of items that define sustainability. And the fact that most private lands in this country are certified to this standard ensures that we have good management of private lands. Now, not all private lands are wild. Not all of private lands are going to be older growth. If you think about zoning the country, there are some places where you're growing an agricultural crop of southern yellow pine. And that's what we use to build houses, 2x4s and plywood and things like that. That's a necessary crop. There are other places where you have natural stands. You want to keep them natural, but they all provide these co-benefits: clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, outdoor recreation, and jobs. The public forests are a different story. When Teddy Roosevelt created the U.S. Forest Service in the early 1900s, it was to protect the forest supply so that this country would be able to harvest timber and grow in a sustainable fashion forevermore. Over time, the American people have decided that national forests, which were created to supply timber, are more like national parks than they are working forests. That is not a political, it is a social designation. And the politics has followed. In other words, we used to get 98% of the fiber used by this country from our national forests. we now get less than 2% of the fiber from national forests. They simply aren't being harvested. And they aren't being harvested because since Earth Day, we have created a slew of laws and regulations that actually make it nearly impossible to harvest timber on those federal lands. And for that, I think the environmental movement has to rethink its path on a go forward basis. Because these forests, if you don't let them burn, and ever since Smokey and the Bear, we put forest fires out. If you don't let them burn and you don't harvest timber, they get overgrown. And when they get overgrown, the trees get stressed. When the trees get stressed, they're subject to bugs and beetles, and most importantly, they're subject to massive catastrophic wildfires. And we're seeing this all across the Western United States, where most of these national forests are. They burn, and when they burn, it's catastrophic. And so we need to think about allowing increased harvesting in national forests, managed sustainably. This is not a free-for-all where you go in and liquidate the forest or allow any activity that you want in those forests. But those forests need to be managed in a thoughtful and sustainable way to reduce wildfire risk, to improve forest health. That will improve biodiversity in those forests. It will allow those forests to stay standing, which helps with climate change, clean air, and clean water. And it will increase jobs and economic uplift in rural communities that, frankly, are in distress because the forest products industry around those national forests has declined so precipitously.
Do you see the environmental movement coming to grips with what you're talking about better?
Very, very slowly. Let me give you a little bit of history to help you understand my answer. As I mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt, really the father of the modern conservation movement in this country in the early 1900s, he established the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service. He didn't create the National Park Service, but he greatly expanded it. And in his day, it was about setting aside land to protect for future generations, creating these incredibly large and magnificent landscapes for wildlife and for aesthetics, beauty, and also for providing fiber for the growing country. And that model lasted up until and through World War II, when the company was industrializing rapidly. And after World War II, the growth of the economy was just on a rocket ship trajectory. And the challenge was not so much the liquidation of magnificent wild landscapes. The challenge was one of industrial pollution, air pollution, water pollution. And so the country, stimulated by a magnificent book and a magnificent woman named Rachel Carson, who published in 1962 Silent Spring, which for the first time linked human health and the environment, the country responded with Earth Day. And after Earth Day, there was a tidal wave of grassroots activity around legislation and regulation. And today, we have over 50,000 pieces of environmental legislation and regulation in the country. And in fact, it makes sense if the issue of the day was stopping bad things from happening, stopping rivers from being polluted, stopping smokestacks from belching pollution and poisoning our children and wildlife, then regulation, legislation, and frankly, litigation were the right tools. The problem, Gregg, is that for the last 55 years, we have relied solely on regulation, legislation, and litigation to try and achieve results. We have perfected our ability to stop things. We have perfected our ability to say no, but we have developed almost no capacity to say yes. We have a really hard time articulating what we are for, although we can tell you clearly what we are against. And frankly, where we are as a country is we need to address these great challenges by building things. Yes, we need to protect more land, millions of acres of land, but think about climate change. In order to increase the amount of renewables coming into the grid, we need to build anywhere from 500,000 to 800,000 miles of new transmission capacity. It would be the largest national infrastructure project ever completed. By comparison, the interstate highway system, which was completed in 1956 when Eisenhower was president, is only 46,000 miles. Now compare that to 5, 6, 7, 800,000 miles of new transmission
Mm,
capacity to feed the energy demand that, frankly, AI and new data centers are pushing ever higher. And yet the environmental community has perfected the art of stopping every major infrastructure project, even those that would address climate change.
yeah,
We need to turn this around. Our work on working farms, our work on working forests, and now our work at the intersection of energy transition, building infrastructure, addressing climate change, delivering more energy for a growing country. I think that's the future of the movement, but it means redefining conservation as solving problems, not stopping projects.
yeah.
And to me, that is the greatest challenge for the environmental movement, one that we hope to continue to lead.
Yeah, and that's why I love having you on the program, and I want to do more of this. I mean, that was, very interesting, and I'd love to ask you a million questions about all that. Going back to the wildfires, I mean, what I really think is the entire environmental movement needs to have like a month-long summit where everybody's on Zoom and we're all fleshing out all these issues and coming up with some consensus positions because I think, that everybody going off in a different direction, not even really knowing what they're talking about, is why I think we're in this situation that we're in right now. But let's go back to just quickly about the wildfires and the forests and the situation and the solution that you're presenting, which I think a lot of the movement is moving in that direction. And the administration now has talked about opening up forests for more timber. So I'm assuming you've been following that topic, and I'm hoping that they're doing what they're aiming to do is to do it in a way which would be cohesive with what you're saying, and that they would thin out the forests in the most beneficial way to reduce wildfire, eliminate the infestation problems and all that.
Yes, we're following this very closely. And the challenge is that policy, particularly at the federal level, is often a blunt instrument. It's a one size fits all. And I think we need a little more thoughtfulness when we think about harvesting in national forests because every forest is different. Every forest has different characteristics, different communities, different wildlife, different water. And so, yes, in general, I am very supportive of increasing sustainable harvesting on public lands because I think it will improve forest health. It certainly will improve resilience against climate change and wildfires. Incidentally, it also will improve rural economics. And I think we need to focus as a country on increasing the resilience and helping rural communities not just survive, but thrive. And so we would like to engage more fully. We would hope others would also be solution oriented so that we can, in fact, address these great societal challenges in America around forests and fires and rural economic development, but do it in a way that is not just a blunt instrument. For example, if there are endangered species, let's be very thoughtful about that. If there are wetlands, let's be very thoughtful about that. If we're adjacent to indigenous lands, let's be very thoughtful about that, how we work with those communities. The difficulty is when you're talking about 190 or 200 million acres of national forest, the blunt instrument tends to win the day. And I think they're moving in the right direction. We support it. We'd like to engage more fully. We hope others will join us. But in general, improving harvests on these public lands would be a good thing.
All right. So as we're talking, I'm trying to think who would be your target audience for private landowners that are sitting on 20 acres. They got trees. They don't even know that it's a forest. They're doing estate planning. They're like, they don't want the next generation to pave the whole thing over and, make some skate park or whatever. Is that, am I in the right angle here with who should
Well,
be maybe reaching out to you and talking to you about it?
yes, you're exactly right. There are the big institutional owners of land. They own millions of acres of land, and then there are the small family forest landowners. There's a wonderful organization called the Forest Landowners Association. It's a trade association for those smaller forest landowners. And I would encourage any small landowner who wants more information about how to pass on that land, how to deal with tax treatments, how to find a consulting forester, how to get wood to markets. The Forest Landowner Association is a great organization for that. We tend to operate at the much larger level, 10,000 acres up to hundreds of thousands of acres. And anybody that is looking to joint venture or partner with us to help conserve those lands, but make sure they stay as working for us, we would welcome those discussions.
Nice. All right. So we got three more buckets, at least that I know of, that the TCF uh, basically works with. You got legacy properties, you got business opportunities, and the rural community, which you've already sort of touched on. But, and did I get it right? And if I
Yeah,
did, give us a preview, not a preview, but basically a briefing on all three and how those communities should, connect with you, why they should connect with you.
yeah. So think about it. Next year is the 250th anniversary of the United States. And a lot of celebrations being planned. I know the president is very focused on this, as he should be. And the reality is that all across this country, there are lands, historic and cultural lands, that have defined us as a nation. They've shaped us as a people. And yet we are losing these lands at an alarming rate because they're in private hands. As land changes hands, it gets developed, or uh, just the natural disappearance of these historical and culturally important sites. For example, most Civil War battlefield sites were in private hands until we, the Conservation Fund, launched a campaign with the Richard King Mellon Foundation to buy the most important Civil War battlefield sites. And now almost 45 of those sites are in public hands, most of them with the National Park Service, protected forever, telling the story of the Civil War so that future generations can learn. Similarly, almost all of the Lewis and Clark sites mentioned in the journals when they went west to discover the Western Passage when Thomas Jefferson was president, those were in private hands. We have now acquired all of the key Lewis and Clark sites, and they are protected in perpetuity. Similarly, we are now very focused on Black history and some of the key sites. Harriet Tubman's birthplace, the Buffalo Soldiers, the last battle of the Civil War in Alabama, Martin Luther King sites. We just acquired great author Zora Neale Hurston's house in Florida, and that will now be protected for all time. Carr's Beach, which was an African American site on Chesapeake Bay where Black families would spend summers and recreate. These are sites that are critically important to telling the stories of this country. And I believe these are critically important for future generations to know the history of this country. It's not about denigrating America. It's not about teaching bad sentiments to our young people. It's about teaching them the real history of this country so that they can make good decisions going forward. And our Legacy Places campaign is about protecting those sites, cultural and historic sites that are absolutely essential to telling the story of the country. And I think as we approach our 250th anniversary as a nation, we need increased investment in these types of properties.
Nice. I love Zora Neale. I mean, I was in my earlier days, I tried to become a fiction writer, and I was really big with her and Alice Walker. I'm just in the middle of watching a new documentary called, I think it's called Ms. And I didn't realize Alice Walker was work for them right before she did Color Purple. But amazing when I saw on your website with Zora, that really touched me. All right, so what about the business opportunities that you also focus in on? I mean, you're not just talking about rural forest farms. You're also talking like, the urban core. What are you doing there?
Certainly, and think about it. It's not easy being a publicly held company in the world today, especially in an deregulatory environment that we're in right now, what happens is the white hot spotlight of attention gets pointed on big companies, and the American people expect companies to take up those responsibilities that previously were handled by government, things like clean air and clean water, climate change, and all of the above. And so one of the things that we do is engage with companies to help them think through a sustainability path that allows them to grow their business and generate significant returns, but do so in a way that benefits people and communities over the long term. And that's not something that most companies are geared up to do. They know how to run their business, they know how to make money, but how to engage with communities, particularly at a local or grassroots level, is often not a skill set that they have. And thinking about how to make money in ways that preserve sustainability often is not something they have a great deal of expertise around. These are skill sets that the Conservation Fund has developed over the last 40 years. At any one time, we've worked with more than half of the Fortune 500 to think through some of these issues. And so we welcome those opportunities to help companies navigate the tricky waters they find themselves in right now, balancing their economic growth and their mandate for fiduciary return to their shareholders with their obligation to take care of their employees, their customers, and the communities in which they operate.
So I think for me, the last 10 years has been an extremely big learning opportunity with all that's going on in politics and the world and the environment and climate and all that. And at times I get a little upset. I'm like, wow, I can't believe it's going in this direction. What's wrong with everybody? What's wrong with me? I don't know. Maybe something's wrong with me. And before we got on to the discussion today, I asked you what your objectives were, and one that I definitely share is how what you're doing seems to be, or you believe, is the future of the environmental movement. And I'd like you to kind of touch on that and explain what you mean by that.
In the past, the environmental movement has relied primarily on either government funding or philanthropy, charitable giving. And make no mistake, we live in the most charitable country in the world. Philanthropy is very well developed, very well established. People are very generous in this country. But the truth of the matter is, Greg, that the challenges we face today are far greater than the amount of philanthropy that's available. We need to engage the private sector. They have the money, they have the people, they have the motivation, they understand how to work with speed and scale and sophistication. What I see as the future of the environmental movement, I call it an era of convergence, if you will, is the integration of two of the most powerful forces in the country today, the environmental movement and the free enterprise system. The environmental movement needs to use the tools of the marketplace and engage more fully with the economic interests in this country. And the economic interests need to understand that balancing environmental and economic objectives is a more durable outcome, one that benefits the country and will allow the country to advance in meaningful ways. And so I see the future of the environmental movement more leaning toward conservation, which I see as this interplay between economics and environment, less about regulation or legislation or litigation, which have been the tools in the past. And that is a new model, frankly, not one that's being widely talked about. But as I get on in my years, and I've now been with the Conservation Fund for 35 years, it is my personal mission, my mandate, to begin to chart a course toward this next era of the environmental movement in this country. And I think it lies at the integration of the environmental movement and the free enterprise system.
Nice. All right, we're going to leave it at that. For those out there that are listening that want to help, help the Conservation Fund buy in on what you're doing, what can they do?
Well, first of all, they can go to our website as you have. I think it's a fabulous website. Our team has done a magnificent job, and they can learn about the things we're doing. People have interests in different aspects of our work, and they can pick and choose. But the reality is we are limited only by the amount of capital that we can deploy. And frankly, we can deploy capital almost on an investment basis so that people can get their money back with some nominal return. They don't need to give it to us permanently. And that allows us to acquire farmland, to acquire forest land, and achieve a permanent and durable conservation outcome, but also return capital back to the people who have allowed us essentially to borrow their balance sheets. And so there are all kinds of creative ways to engage with us. And after looking at the website or listening to your great podcast, if people would like to get in touch with me directly, I would welcome the chance to visit with them.
And how should they get in touch with you?
www.conservationfund.org.
All right, we're going to leave it with that. Larry Selzer, CEO and president of the Conservation Fund up in Northern Virginia, doing amazing work. The future of our planet might lie in your hands, Larry. So get back to work.
Thank you. And thanks for having me, Greg. It was wonderful to be with you and your audience.
All right, folks, it's key. I don't care. You don't have to subscribe or rate or review. I want you to share this episode so that people in your community can hear what we were talking about. And Larry, good luck with everything. And thank you for coming on the show.
Greg, thank you so much.
That's all for this episode of Cut to the Chase. But before you go, will you open up your podcast app and give us a 5-star review? You can also leave a comment about what you liked most or other topics you'd like us to cover. And please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming shows. Thanks, everybody. Be safe out there.